Welcome to the discussion. My guest today is Martin Rieger, the Chief Solutions Officer and Chief Information Security Officer at stackArmor. Martin, thanks so much for taking the time to join me.
Thank you so much for having me.
We're having a conversation today about regulatory. We're not going to bore people, I promise. When people hear regulatory frameworks and regulatory meeting compliance issues, this is actually growing importance across all of industry. I was at a recent conference and a lot of the discussion points, I had a DoD guest and a lot of, what about CMMC? How about FedRAMP? How about this? How about that? I think it's on a lot of people's minds. So let's start there. The FedRAMP is the big one. We know you got to be FedRAMP compliant for cloud service providers. What are you seeing around FedRAMP? How has it changed? How do you get compliance? Give me a sense of what you're seeing in the community.
Well, this is a very hot topic right now. We just had the latest revision of FedRAMP baselines released on Monday, May 29th. And what we tend to find when companies are preparing for compliance framework like FedRAMP is, one, they tend to budget improperly because they don't know what they don't know. But there is more than just the paperwork, right? There is the design and implementation of systems that need to meet the complex architecture requirements, things like federal encryption, along with the company itself. So one of the biggest mistakes that companies make is to think that it's all about the product or the solution. It is as much about the organization going through the process as it is about delivering a cloud solution or a cloud service offering to the government.
I saw the Rev 5 update. It's something we've all been waiting for in the nerd community that I'm in. Maybe just give a quick high-level view of one or two or three or however many you think. Are there specific changes you'd want to highlight to folks really should, hey, here's something you should pay attention to?
Absolutely. A couple of the biggest ticket items are the inclusion of supply chain risk management, right? So in the last couple of years, we've had multiple executive orders come out as a result of breaches like SolarWinds, for example. What happened with the Colonial Pipeline to the point that software bill of materials, or SBOMs, are the biggest hot topic that you're going to see going throughout the government right now. And as we all know, it takes about 2 years from the moment a decision's made to before dollars are actually spent. So we're coming up on that time period here in October next fiscal year where agencies will have the funding to support this. So supply chain risk management did not exist in the last baseline. There was a single control that sort of addressed it to a point, but going forward, companies have to have a policy around it. They've got to have procedures to support it, plus a plan that didn't exist before.
You bring this up, and there was actually just a letter from GSA that got a little bit of a buzz around a policy letter that said, we had told you needed by mid-June to do software attestation. Well, we're going to put this off now because OMB is going to come back with a new date for when that would be due. Because I think a lot of people realized how challenging it was on the contractor side versus just the government side. The other piece I think that I want to talk through around FedRAMP as well is when you say they think it's all about the product or solution. Am I FedRAMP approved? Am I low, medium, high? But you said there's more than just the product. It's the whole entire infrastructure that they have to think about. Why is that so important? And what are some of those considerations when they think about infrastructure? It's not just, again, did I fill out the paperwork?
Yeah, so when we talk about the organization, right, it is the training of the personnel, the hiring, firing, transferring, background checks, and then the entire process of developing the product, right? Including development and testing. So when we talk about it being more than just paperwork and more than just architecture, right? It is the ongoing monitoring and management, which in our line of work, we say life begins at the authorization, because as much work as it is to get prepared, I used to equate it to having a baby because it used to take about 9 months to get through it. But basically, it's when it's born, right? That authorization is the caring, feeding, maintenance, and continuous development. That's the difficult work. But the preparation that goes into developing policies for 17 different NIST families, now 18 with supply chain, can be a bit of a culture shock for organizations who before were, for all intents and purposes, in the Wild Wild West. They had no oversight, they had no compliance.
You didn't say the words, but I'll bring it up. Continuous monitoring. It's something that FedRAMP is actually looking at. We saw the recently FedRAMP Advisory Committee came out with there was a white paper from OMB that talked about, well, how would you do continuous monitoring? How could it be added in? Do you have clients who are saying we have to figure that out, or have you seen clients figure out how to add that continuous monitoring piece to their FedRAMP cloud service?
Yes, so continuous monitoring, or CONMON, or in some organizations, security operations, regardless of how you classify it, again, it's not a paperwork exercise because it's a continuous ongoing effort that has daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly, and annual obligations of scanning, reporting, the ability to respond to incidents, backup and recovery, along with new deployments of services and features and capabilities. So when you talk about continuous monitoring, that's part of where I was saying life begins at that ATO. It's after the ATO that you enter this phase that we're talking about.
There's a lot around FedRAMP we could continue down, but there's also, we could spend the whole time on FedRAMP. And what's interesting is I think a lot of folks feel like, oh, why do we still talk about FedRAMP? And I think the answer is there's a big push from the White House, a big push from OMB, but also agencies who want more cloud services. The software as a service, and you probably have looked at the number of cloud services approved, it's pushing over, I think, 300 now. And they probably want to get 500, 600, 700, even more. But there's an intersection between FedRAMP and some of these other regulatory requirements. Talk a little bit about what are you seeing, for instance, CMMC, Cybersecurity Model Maturity Model Certification Program. Where do you see some of those overlaps and integrations?
Well, first I'll touch on FedRAMP numbers, and when the FedRAMP marketplace did hit 300 last month, and that's after 10 years.
Right.
However, there are thousands of FedRAMP authorized systems. Those just happen to be the ones that are listed in the marketplace. Where this intersects with other components like the Department of Defense, who has their own process that is run by DISA, Defense Information Systems Agency, that is built on top of FedRAMP, right? It includes more enhanced parameters, additional controls, but it's also captured as impact levels as opposed to risk levels. So on the federal side, low, moderate, high. On the DoD side, there are basically 4 different levels. And when a cloud service provider has a product that they want to take through DoD that is built on FedRAMP going towards one of those levels, well, then comes into play the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, or CMMC, which is designed to demonstrate that a company can manage and take care of controlled unclassified information in the form of contracts and federal contract information and Department of Defense data. So there is an overlap between the two in a couple different ways. Folks can leverage FedRAMP services to meet CMMC compliance, but FedRAMP's for systems, CMMC is for organizations kind of back office and how they email, transfer, store, and process that DoD data. Before CMMC, we had the NIST 800-171, which is for controlled and classified information. And since then, the biggest difference between what we were doing prior to CMMC and now is that CMMC requires a third-party assessment organization to come in and validate all of that controlled unclassified information policy and procedure that companies have to meet.
I want to go back on 2 things for clarification, make sure folks who are listening aren't confused. You mentioned impact levels, and you went to 1 through 4. There's also 5 and 6. So you're just talking about the unclassified side, not necessarily impact levels 5 and 6, which my understanding is it's more of the classified, the higher level.
So there's 6 levels, but 1 and 3 were deprecated. So it's 2, 4, 5, and 6. 2 is equivalent of a moderate system. And so most FedRAMP systems at the moderate level can be accepted within DoD without any additional assessment or review. When you move into impact level 4, which is kind of in between moderate and high, that's where you start to get into CUI, FOUO.
Right.
And then as you mentioned, 5 confidential, 6 secret and top secret.
And then the other piece is you were talking a little about CMMC, and I just don't want people to get scared because there's a lot of discussion around CMMC. We're still waiting on a lot from DoD. They have not finalized anything. So you're talking more this idea that when CMMC, all the signals are pointing that you would need a 3PAO, you would need some where they're focused on. Because right now I think the focus is still on NIST 800-171 because CMMC is unfortunately a couple years away from being final. Just want to make sure folks aren't confused or anything.
Yeah, that's 100% spot on. My understanding right now is that the baselines are being finalized. It'll go before Congress here in the next few weeks, and then hopefully by the end of the year, by October maybe, we'll see that. But what's being done in the meantime is continuing to use 171.
Right. And 171 is really important. There's a whole, I always love talking to folks about, even if CMMC never comes to fruition, and it probably will, but even if it doesn't, I would argue, and hopefully you maybe agree to this or maybe not, I would argue that CMMC did its job by getting people to focus on the importance of 171 and protecting controlled unclassified information. I'll just be selfish and say, do you get that same feeling that as you talk to your government contractor clients, oh, CMMC, we got to pay attention to 171 because no matter what CMMC says, we know we're being held more accountable?
Absolutely. No, the impact 171 had back in 2017 when the mandate came down, and all defense industrial base organizations must now attest, compared to CMMC saying, we're going to come check. Right? That lit a fire. And there's over 300,000 companies in the defense industrial base that we know of. And so when you tell folks, we are going to now come check and audit this, it had an impact.
Well, I'm glad that my feeling was at least you're helping me out there. And I want to go back to FedRAMP for a second because you mentioned something really important. Rev 5 is out. I think there was a party, there's probably cake at the FedRAMP office, PMO, at least they should have had it. As folks are preparing to shift towards Rev 5, what should they keep in mind? I think there's different buckets of different companies as they should, and how they should look at Rev 5.
So for companies that are already authorized, there will be a transition period, but there are also new parameters, new requirements. One notable example is CIS benchmarks, which are the hardening requirements of a system. CIS Level 2, which is Center for Internet Security, is the new foundation, but there are also DoD STIGs, which are Secure Technical Implementation Guidelines. Those are a big deviation from what we saw before. Additionally, as we mentioned earlier, there is the supply chain risk management aspects, but for companies who are just in the process of considering going through FedRAMP, the budgeting for this is something that has to be carefully planned for and thought out. It needs to be prepared in a way that organizations have a 3 to 5 year budget aligned with the requirements of their system, including things like licensing, hosting costs, as well as the initial assessment and the annual assessments, which are all a part of continuous monitoring, as we mentioned before. The personnel expertise and knowledge required for this, from engineers and architects, as well as security analysts, security managers, and officers, are typically roles that most companies don't have in place. So budgeting first and foremost, but then sponsorship is another critical piece of this. Agencies are the ones who accept the risk. And regardless of what path a company goes through to achieve FedRAMP, it's the agencies that are authorizing at the end of the day. So agencies are a partner, but without a sponsor, companies are in a very difficult position, which is to say they could get prepared, they could even get assessed. But without a sponsor, they're kind of dead in the water.
And we know that the Joint Authorization Board, the JAB, takes a long time. They only do a dozen or so a year. So that's a path that not a lot of folks are going down, though I think everybody would love to use the JAB, but getting that agency sponsor is so important. Now, I want to talk a little bit about that preparation and the maintaining piece, but let me take a half a step back. If I'm a company who is in the middle of FedRAMP process already, maybe I'm in process, as they call it. Do I have to worry about Rev 5? Do I have to worry about Rev 5 next year or next time I get authorized? That's the big issue.
It's a very big issue. So anybody that, any organization that either was not in process, and in process means engaged with a 3PAO and or agency, or the JAB, for instance, prior to May 30th of 2023, has to start with the Rev 5 baseline. So they could have last month completed all their documentation. It will have to go back and be uplifted. So for companies who unfortunately may not have started before that period, it is a lot of work. And they will have to go back and take into account, like the CIS benchmarks, for example. I have 4 customers right now who are in a similar boat, who have completed documentation and reached out and said, hey, what does this mean for us? Well, what it means is the addition of the supply chain risk management family, the plan that comes with it, and then an update to parameters and hardening and benchmarks.
And if you're already FedRAMP authorized, and then you are going to come up for renewal or new assessment in 2024, that's when Rev 5 kicks in for them.
It will. It will depend on where their next annual review starts. So for instance, anybody that's in the middle of one right now will ideally have about a year from now. But it also is at the discretion of the agency sponsors who are managing and basically doing the agency side of the reports and reviews. And so,
it's that risk. If they believe that they want the CSI benchmarks, they're going to say, I want those benchmarks, and because we believe that it's going to help reduce our risk. So that's why the company may end up going, oh, I got to get that done sooner than later. But the agency may also say the opposite. We like where we're at today, but in a year from now, we'll expect you at Rev 5. So I think that's kind of what you're seeing.
Absolutely. I've got a company that we just addressed this exact issue with last week. Bluescape is an organization that is accredited across multiple FedRAMP paths. They are a DoD Impact Level 4. They are a FedRAMP Moderate. And at those levels, their questions were like, okay, so we've got this FedRAMP Rev 5, but what about DoD? Because the additional baselines are not just for the federal government. This is also impacting DoD risk levels. So for them, it's a twofold approach. They've got to uplift for DoD and also meet federal at the same time.
You also went through this idea of maintaining your FedRAMP, and I think this is important. Budgeting 3 to 5 years, understanding your annual assessments, understanding your sponsorship. What's the big challenge, or what's the big pothole, or however you want to talk about it? Is it a lack of planning that the companies are doing in terms of, I'm not one and done. They think they're one and done, or once a year and done. It's that long tail that they're not considering.
It is the timeline for this, which includes, as you kind of mentioned, planning and preparation. There is a period of discovery and design analysis, and the way we've typically done this for customers is discovery is similar to a gap assessment of architecture, encryption, and how the organization operates at that moment, while simultaneously preparing all their documentation and capturing that information in what's known as a system security plan so that they can then be audited. Understanding how long that takes from a realistic standpoint, which we're very, very mature after 10 years of doing this across all the companies that provide this type of support. But once it moves into that assessment phase and a 3PAO comes in, knowing what that looks like from a planning perspective and then accounting for the government timelines, which can stretch, right? That's where planning really comes in. So there is a push out there from the community to say, well, we can get you ready in 8 weeks. Well, getting someone ready and getting them authorized are two different things, but it tends to confuse the market because they're like, oh, I'll be FedRAMPed in 8 weeks. No, you can get an environment ready, but there is still a period of performance, in other words, a history of audit logs and records that then are assessed before the government even gets involved. So if you were to look at the FedRAMP website, for example, there are timelines, but they have no timeline for all of the activities we're talking about. They have timelines for once the assessment happens. Right. So planning properly is critical, and if you don't prepare in such a way that you have those expectations of, say, 6 to 9 months or 3 to 6 months, depending on the type of system, it can become very costly.
I'm glad you brought up cost. There's always a lot of concern over the last 10, 12 years about the cost of FedRAMP. Why is it so expensive? Have you seen those costs come down at all? Have you seen the way the FedRAMP Program Office applying automation, applying FedRAMP tailored? Is that making a difference in the costs?
Costs have come down in a number of ways. One is through accelerators. And so, for example, we've developed an approach based on customer need. Customers kept showing up and saying, hey, is there any way you guys can go ahead and just put all the security architecture in place for us? Sure. Well, over time, that's become infrastructure as a code, cloud formation and terraforming, to the point that what used to take months to deploy, we do in days, right? And that cuts down the preparation timeline. But then there's all of the licensing considerations, the tools and technology. So as you mentioned, over the last 10 years, it's matured big time, but at the same time, the understanding what tools and technologies that also meet encryption requirements, that meet configuration mandates and things like that, well, by having those pre-selected in a ready-to-go stack, that is another time saver. The average time it takes a company to figure all this out, do the research and development, and then get quotes is 4 to 5 months. So if you're doing that before you've even started the FedRAMP process, when it's already been done, that's another accelerator. Documentation is another big area where acceleration has occurred, which is to say having policies and procedures as what we would call starter templates that no longer take 3 to 4 months to develop, but can be knocked out in a matter of weeks. Just another example. So planning and preparing, having a budget, but also a stack and an architecture or an accelerator is another great way to get through the process faster.
It's great use of infrastructure as code, plug and play that in, hopefully, and make life a lot easier. And you can change that code as necessary because of Rev 6, that I'm sure is coming out soon. Martin, we're about less than a minute left, so let me just ask you, we've talked a lot about FedRAMP, a little bit about CMMC, but this whole focus of today was getting that compliance issue, and it's always more than just compliance, but it's a big piece. What advice do you have? What's our takeaway from our conversation today?
So my advice would be, having an advisor is one of the most critical steps you can take. We used to equate it to building a house. I could probably try to build a house myself, and it will take a long time, and maybe I'll figure it out and make mistakes, but when you have a FedRAMP advisor or a CMMC advisor, you have an expert on your side, an augmentation to the team who can get you through the process quickly, efficiently, and in a way that saves time and money.
I always like to say I could change my own oil, but I also could go to another place and have them do it for me, and that's a lot easier. Martin, I really much enjoyed our conversation. Unfortunately, we are out of time, so let me thank my guest. Martin Rieger is the Chief Solutions Officer and Chief Information Security Officer at stackArmor. Martin, thanks so much.
Thank you.
I'm Jason Miller, and you've been listening to the discussion, Simplifying Federal Regulatory Security and Compliance Requirements, sponsored by stackArmor on Federal News Network. For more on this discussion, visit federalnewsnetwork.com and search stackArmor.